Well, thanks for being part of this podcast. I'm Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. Justin Brierley has a fairly new book out called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I've done one podcast on it already. I'll tell you what it really interests me in this is that I've been reading in different fields over the last year or two and noticed how many different, whether it's science or philosophy or history or whatever, how many people who are intellectuals and people who have at one time walked away from God are coming back to God. And so this book captures what's happening, I think. People are beginning to consider Christianity again, as he says in his subtitle here. So here's chapter 2 of the book, again, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And he was, remember, Brierley has a podcast, and he has all sorts of interesting people come and talk. And so he was setting up to have Jordan Peterson. And what a name, huh? And it said Peterson became very famous. He had a bunch of debates at one time with Sam Harris, and they filled arenas with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people to show up and hear him talk. He had a 2-year speaking tour. He addressed hundreds of thousands in auditoriums all over the globe. He had podcasts, he had YouTube videos. They were reaching millions of people. And then he disappeared from public eye. So Brierley was giving us the background of what happened. So he had a tough schedule. He just ground him down. His wife had a cancer diagnosis that they were unprepared for. And he had an unwitting addiction to anti-anxiety medication. It left him just kind of a shadow of his former self. But thanks to his daughter, he was able to detox from the medication and build his strength again. So even though he was gone for a while from the public eye, the phenomenon that surrounded him didn't go away. Said he's got his book out, 12 Rules, and he had a sequel to it. And it said there are millions of people, especially young men, which I think is really fascinating, who are following his podcast and his videos and his lectures. And of course, he is controversial. So Brierley wants to find out, ask a key question here. How did he become such a rock star of public intellectuals, and why are so many young men following him? Well, Peterson kind of popped into popularity in 2016. He was a psychology lecturer at the University of Toronto, and people there liked him, the students liked him, but he wasn't known much beyond that. But Canada at that time proposed and then later set up new laws that potentially could criminalize anybody who refused to address transgender people by their preferred pronouns. He wanted to be they or some other pronoun. He objected. He said, I'm not being anti-transgender rights. He said it's the state criminalizing the use of language, and in his view, that was the first step toward the George Orwell 1984 kind of tyranny. Well, his public protest, he delivered it via YouTube, got him in a lot of trouble with university authorities and campus protest groups, and he got shouted down by angry students and all. But he said he's trying to defend the classic liberal values of academic liberty and freedom of speech. But he said instead what he's noticing is there's identity politics that's growing, people identifying themselves by sexuality, by gender, and by race, kind of a form of what he called cultural Marxism. But he's not the only one, by the way, the only intellectual that's beginning to criticize the progressive left. Since New Atheism got stuck in its rut, he's actually become a standard bearer for a group of thinkers that have been loosely labeled the intellectual dark web. It's a band of secular journalists, psychologists, academics, historians, and scientists who really agree with him about the direction of academia and culture, and they're not afraid to declare this problem. So it's the IDW, it's called, the intellectual dark web. Now, I haven't heard of that, but I trust Brierley. So he said there's overlap between IDW and the New Atheists. Sam Harris, I guess, is kind of got a foot in both camps. But it said the New Atheists say we got to get rid of religion, right? That's the problem. But the IDW people are asking, can we live without God at all? And of course, with Peterson, he even says, what do you mean by God? And it says it's really hard to pin down Peterson with what he believes about God. But he said it's a million miles from the anti-religion of his atheistic peers. And he said he's just one of a lot of secular thinkers that are beginning to rethink the whole value of atheism and religion, and actually at one time were dogmatically anti-religious, and they're beginning to turn away from that. Here's another example besides Peterson. Brierley mentions, see here, Peter Boghossian. Up till 2021, he was an assistant professor of philosophy at Portland State, and he was a strong atheist, and his blog and his information went everywhere. He had a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and it was how to persuade people to abandon their religious delusions. He was a champion of what was called street epistemology, kind of a reverse street evangelism, and skeptics would go talk to religious people and just get them all messed up by asking them questions. So Brierley asked Boghossian to join him on the show, and actually Boghossian one time said faith belief should be officially categorized as mental disorders. And that tells you how strongly he was against religion. But, and here's the good news, I think, just a few years later, his tone had changed a lot. And I guess Brierley had asked him, could you come on my show and talk about Christianity and atheism? But Boghossian said, well, no. He said, I'm finished with attacking God. And he said, you might actually be surprised at my new attitude toward Christianity. In fact, Boghossian found himself on the side of Christians against other secularists. What happened? Well, Boghossian had decided Christianity was not really the enemy of evidence-based thinking that he had imagined. In fact, Boghossian said something bad is going on in our culture, and it's derailing rational thinking within the academy. And so it emerged that Boghossian, along with James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, were at the center of an academic hoax. I love stuff like this, where they pop the bubble of these intellectuals and these academics that think they've got all the answers to life. So here's what happened. Boghossian and his two friends were really tired of these, what they call grievance studies, university courses and university papers that placed critical theories about race and gender and sexual oppression at the center of every academic discipline. They said, that's going along with this whole woke council culture on campus that was shaming everybody into silence that might have differed with them. Academic freedom was being suffocated. And then it became dogma, these different ideologies. So what these three people decided to do is to expose the stupidity of these academic arguments. So they submitted a series of bogus papers to various peer-reviewed academic journals. And I just love this. I think this is great. So they managed to see papers get published on all sorts of stupid, outlandish theories. One was dogs engaging in rape culture, why heterosexual men like to eat at Hooters. They even managed to dress up segments from Hitler's Mein Kampf with suitable-sounding academic language on a paper that was dealing with intersectional feminism. And so finally they let the cat out of the bag, and everybody understood it was a hoax. And it said the New York Times said it got a lot of mockery toward the academic world. So those three, Boghossian, Lindsay, and Pluckrose, they still call themselves left-wing academics, but they're seeing that liberal voice out there in the academic world being smothered by a culture that says you got to put grievances ahead of objective truth, and they didn't like that. And in fact, Boghossian and others are starting to lead a pushback, along with Christians and people of faith that are concerned by this identity politics and the curtailing of free speech. Well, isn't that nice to hear? Yeah, I like that a whole lot. Now, has he been converted? Boghossian, has he converted to Christianity? No. Brierley says, but he's undergone a great change in his attitude. So the firebrand atheist is gone. Now it's somebody who's troubled by where our culture is going. Since Christianity no longer has the impact that it used to, what's happening? It's not good. So he's beginning to realize we're unleashing something pretty bad in the world. And there are other atheists. Sam Harris says he doesn't harangue Christians anymore. Said he might be realizing the loss of Christianity's cultural dominance might actually be bringing about a problem. So he said, to understand this shift to what's happening to us in a post-Christian West, what Brierley does is have a brief history lesson here. So he said, despite the Enlightenment bringing secularism in, until roughly the mid part of the 20th century, Christianity was the dominant cultural force in the West, and it shaped the psychology of generations of people. For about 2,000 years, Christianity had given people a story to live their lives by, whether it was literally true or people are just kind of dimly aware of the details. It provided a narrative about reality. It had a clear beginning, a present, and a future. So Brierley says, here it is. Here's the story. Creation. In the beginning, God created everything good. Fall. But things went badly wrong as people went their own way. So we rebelled, and it put humans in conflict with God, and in conflict with each other, and in conflict with the world. Third step, or third part of this story, Israel. Beginning with Abraham, God chose a particular people that he could use to demonstrate his character and bring about his redemption plan. Fourth part of this story, redemption. So God has a rescue project for his creation, and it involved actually coming into this world himself in the form of Jesus. So Jesus lived a life that none of us could live, and in his death, in some mysterious way, he bore the consequences of all our failures and all our sins and brought salvation to the whole world. Last part of the story, new creation. Now, every person is invited to step into a future that's defined by the hope of his resurrection and a new world to come. So think about what Brierley says. Just think about this story and what it means, what the assumptions that it means. That, for example, we're all here by design, not accident, and every life is created in the image of God and it has value. And yes, evil and suffering are facts, but someday they'll be vanquished when justice is done. And every person, no matter what their jobs are, their background, or station in life, we're all called to work toward creating a world shaped by the teachings and character of Jesus. Now that's the story out there. It says that grand story of creation and fall and Israel and redemption, new creation, helped to frame people's day-by-day existence for hundreds of years. So the idea, for example, that every life was intended by God, that gave meaning to people's existence. So they had fortitude because they knew Christ himself had gone through so much trouble. It gave them the strength to bear their own sufferings and to see it in the context of a greater purpose. So each person had an identity. We were all servants of God. We're all supposed to model our life and works and hopes and dreams in a pattern that God created and in the life that Jesus lived. So the narrative of Christianity gave people a story to be part of. Okay, so there's the key part. But what's happened now? Well, Christianity has faded. And so what story are we supposed to live by now? One psychologist said this: with the Enlightenment and the move to a secular world, we lost a religious worldview that homed us and gave us access to wisdom. So we now have what this psychologist calls a meaning crisis. Well, here's something else that another concept the Christian worldview gave to the modern world: objective truth. Objective truth. Well, that's starting to go away. So we don't have concepts nowadays about good and evil. Morality is just relative. It's just part of an evolutionary process. We're adapting to different times and cultures. You hear things like, you have your truth, I have mine. The Beatles said, all you need is love. And love is a feeling. So, but Christianity said, okay, we had objective truth. And what about the vision of reality that Christianity gave us? That's disappeared. Church-going, for example, is considered to be kind of quaint. And the nuns, people who have no religious affiliation, have been a fast-growing demographic. They're progressive. They're tech-savvy. They don't think there's any pre-established script for life. So all of these narratives that we used to believe in are now viewed with suspicion. So what do you do today? You rebel against tradition. That's what art and music is doing. He gives an example here about the postmodern age, about what do you trust and the traditions of the past being thrown away. And he uses an example of Disney. It's kind of interesting, huh? Walt Disney, Disneyland. Walt Disney said, if you can dream it, you can do it. And he said, Brierley said, we've done that. So for now, our music and our films and our books, our art told us we just have to throw off the shackles of conventional morality. We just have to follow our dreams. Remember, that's what Walt said. If you can dream it, you can do it. So what are we doing? We're losing a common story that bound us all together. And so now it's the rise of the individual. But there's no communal identity that used to define people. So Brierley says we're the first generation at liberty to invent our own meaning, to find our own identity, and create our own story. And he uses that comment, you do you. And he said, so this is where we are. This is that postmodern trend. We just come up with our own identity. It's not handed to us. And he said, thanks to social media, that's just really getting bigger and bigger. He said other forms of identity like gender and race and class and disability, they become markers of who we are and our place in society as well. So this is going on all the time. A person whose lived experience in today's world, that's going to trump the views of somebody who doesn't share the markers of that identity. You hear things like, my body, my choice, love is love, or trans women are women. Right? Personal experience is the key. It's up to you. It's you individually. Well, I said, actually, we're finding conservatives are just as prone to discarding the concept of objective truth when it suits them as well. And they give an example, the cult-like devotion to Donald Trump. So I said, we get this culture war that's going, the politicization of identity at both ends of the left and the right. He said, so many people are exhausted. They're in the middle in this thing. So he said, here we are. We're in the modern 21st century. The Christian narrative of the past that gave people a sense of common purpose and their place in the cosmos has been overthrown, or it's been forgotten. We've lost our belief in God or any idea of a cosmic order. So what do we have? There's no sacred structure that holds things together. We're left on our own. We're individuals. We're in a world that's chaotic. There's no order. Nobody tells us who we are. There's no sense of security. There's no fit in this at all. And he said, that's why we're dealing with a huge mental health crisis these days. He said, isn't that ironic? We're living in the most materially prosperous time that's ever been. We have a high life expectancy and it's rising. We have access to technology that's amazing. And yet, in spite of all these wonderful things, many surveys show that we're the most unhappy that we've ever been, especially young people. He says mental health problems have skyrocketed. Now he's from England, so he mentions nearly 1/3 of young women in the UK reporting anxiety and depression. 1/3. He says multiple studies have linked this rise in anxiety and depression to the rise of social media. Yeah, and smartphone addiction. Yeah, I've heard that too. So says if you focus upon your own unique individuality as a place for understanding things and life, that's the wrong place to look. Young people, he says, are experiencing a crisis of meaning. 9 out of 10 Brits, remember he's in England, 9 out of 10 ages 16 to 29 said their life lacks purpose or meaning. I just want you to think about that for a minute. 9 out of 10. So you're talking the vast majority of young people in England today say their life lacks purpose or meaning. I see that as a teacher. I think that's true today. Sad, but true. So he said new atheism was trying to tear down the Christian narrative that once gave hope to people's lives. But what's been erected in its place? Well, the hopes of secularism have fallen flat. Yeah, we've got more science, we've got more technology. But does that give society a feeling of flourishing and being connected and happier? No. Technology and social media have only contributed to this meaning crisis. That's so sad. Well, I still have some pages to go in the chapter, and I think I'll stop here because we're kind of halfway through. And so this is where we are, but things are turning around some. So we'll cover that. Maybe I'll do that in the very next podcast because I always hate to stop in the middle of a chapter. But just so you know, I'm trying to keep these podcasts 20 minutes or less because I figure if you're out driving, you're probably 10, 15 minutes from someplace, so you could probably get a podcast under your belt by doing that, or you're in the yard, working in the yard. So if you want longer podcasts, let me know. But I'm trying to keep them shorter and do them twice a week so you get new access. I've got well over 300 podcasts now that you're welcome to take a look at. Well, anyway, I thank you so much for being part of this podcast, and we'll do the other half of the chapter in the next one. Thanks.